In the spring of 1974, a county surveyor named Elias Coop drove his truck up a washed-out logging road into a stretch of the Missouri Ozarks that the state maps left blank, not marked private, not marked protected. Just blank, a pale patch where the contour lines stopped on one edge and started again on the other, as if the whole valley had been quietly erased. The locals called it Widow's Hollow. The old-timers in the nearest town wouldn't drive past the turnoff after dark, and they had a habit of changing the subject when you asked why. The family that lived up there, the Marlows, had not paid a cent of tax, registered a single birth, or buried a single body on any county record in over 90 years. Coop went up there to draw a line on a map. What he found instead was a stone staircase, wide enough for 6 men walking abreast, sinking straight down into the hillside. And at the bottom of it, half swallowed by red clay. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. A door. He never finished the survey. Within a week, Coop had resigned his position, sold his house, and moved his family 3 states away. The one interview he ever gave, to a small paper in 1981, ran 4 sentences before the reporter noted that the old man's hands were shaking too hard to hold his coffee. This is the story of the Marlow clan of Widow's Hollow. It is a story about a family, but it is also a story about what that family was sitting on top of. Because the deeper you dig into the Marlows, the more you realize they were not the rot. They were the ones who found the rot, moved in, and got rich off of it. Let's go back to the beginning. Or at least, to the beginning as the county allowed it to be written. The official history of Widow's Hollow starts in 1849, when a man calling himself Absalom Marlow filed a claim on 800 acres of what the land office described as unimproved wilderness. That phrase matters, so hold on to it. Unimproved wilderness. The land office was saying, on paper, that nobody had ever built anything there, that the hollow was raw forest, untouched since creation. Absalom paid for the claim in gold coin, which was unusual for a dirt-poor migrant in 1849, and he paid the full amount at once, which was almost unheard of. The clerk who processed the claim noted in the margin that Marlow arrived with 3 wagons, 11 people who were not his family, and a set of surveying tools finer than anything the county government owned. Then he went up into the blank valley and, for the better part of a decade, nobody heard from him again. When the Marlows came back down, they were wealthy. Not comfortable, not doing well. Wealthy in a way that made no sense for a family running a hardscrabble homestead in the middle of nowhere. By 1861, Absalom Marlow was the single largest depositor at the bank in the county seat, and the ledger, which survived because the bank building outlived 3 fires, shows those deposits coming almost entirely in one form: copper, refined copper in ingots, stamped with a maker's mark that no historian has ever matched to a known American foundry. Where does a family in the Ozarks get tons of refined copper in 1861? There were no copper mines in that part of Missouri. There is no copper ore in those hills worth the effort of digging, and yet the Marlows were bringing it down out of the hollow by the wagon load, year after year, for 30 years. Here is where the official story and the buried story start to come apart, because the land office said the hollow was unimproved wilderness. But the thing Elias Coop found at the bottom of that staircase in 1974 was not wilderness. It was a wall, cut stone, fitted so tightly that he claimed you could not slide a knife blade between the blocks, running underground for a distance he was too frightened to measure. And the Marlows had known about it since 1849. That is the part the surveyor understood, standing in the dark with his flashlight, that made him sell his house. Absalom Marlow did not build his fortune. He inherited it from something that was already there, something that was already buried, something the maps had been carefully drawn to hide. To understand what was under Widow's Hollow, we have to talk about the thing that mainstream history insists never happened. We have to talk about the mud. Anyone who has spent time looking at old photographs of American cities in the 19th century has noticed something strange, even if they could not name it. The buildings are too grand. A frontier town of 4,000 people, barely connected to anywhere by rail, somehow has a courthouse with a dome that would embarrass a European capital. The ground floors of buildings sit half below street level, their windows peeking up over the dirt like they were designed for a world where the ground was lower. Whole rows of arched windows are bricked up and buried, doing nothing, serving no purpose a builder would ever intend. The explanation we are given is that people just liked ambitious architecture and that streets got raised for drainage. Maybe. But in the Ozarks, in the hollows the maps refused to name, the alternative explanation was not a theory. For the Marlows, it was the family business. The buried world beneath Widow's Hollow was not a mine, and it was not a cave. It was a settlement. A city, some of the Marlow descendants would later claim, though the word city does strange things to your mind when you are standing in one that has been packed in clay for who knows how long. The stone the walls were cut from does not appear anywhere else in that region. The copper the family sold for 3 decades had not been mined. It had been salvaged, stripped from the structures below, like a man pulling wire out of the walls of a house that flooded. Absalom Marlow's great genius, the thing that separated him from every other dirt-poor claimant of 1,849, was that he understood what he was looking at. He did not see wilderness. He saw a warehouse, and he spent the rest of his life quietly emptying it. Now, you have to ask the obvious question. If there was a buried city under the Ozarks, why does no history book mention it? Why was the land office so certain the ground was untouched? And this is where the Marlow story stops being about one greedy family and starts being about something much larger, something that stretched across the entire continent in the middle of the 1800s. Because the Marlows were not the only family who got rich this way. They were just one of the ones who got caught. The pattern repeats. A migrant family arrives in a remote area with more money and better tools than they should have. They claim wilderness. Within a generation they are inexplicably wealthy, dealing in salvaged materials that have no local source. And the official record, the maps and the deeds and the census, is scrubbed so clean around them that a valley 800 acres wide can simply be a blank patch on a state map well into the 1970s. The people who study this call it the reset. The idea, stripped of all the wilder embellishments, is simple and unsettling. Somewhere in the not-too-distant past, a world existed that was more advanced than the one that officially replaced it. That world ended, or was ended, in a series of events that left much of it buried under a layer of sediment that geologists would later wave away as ordinary erosion. And in the aftermath, a new order was built on top of the ruins, not by rediscovering what was lost, but by controlling access to it, by deciding who got to dig, who got to profit, and who got to write the history that told everyone else the ground had always been empty. The Marlow clan, in this telling, were not visionaries, and they were not criminals in the ordinary sense. They were licensed scavengers, given a valley to strip in exchange for their silence. Let's talk about how a family keeps a secret like that for 90 years, because the answer is ugly, and it is the reason Widow's Hollow earned its name. Absalom Marlow had a problem that every salvage operation faces. He needed labour. Emptying a buried city of its copper and its cut stone is backbreaking, dangerous work, and you cannot hire the local men to do it, because the local men will talk. They will come down out of the hollow at the end of the day and tell their wives what they saw, and within a year the story will be everywhere, and the valley will be swarming with people who want their cut. So Absalom needed workers who could not talk, workers with no family to run home to, no town to spread rumours in, no one who would come looking if they never came back down. He needed people the world had already agreed to forget. And in the middle of the 19th century, the American economy had built an entire system for producing exactly those people. They were called the orphan trains. Between the 1850s and the 1920s, an estimated 200,000 children were loaded onto trains in the cities of the East and shipped west, to be handed out at station platforms to whoever would take them. The official story is one of charity, of poor city orphans being given fresh starts on wholesome farms, and for some children that is genuinely what happened, but there was no oversight worth the name. A man could stand on a platform in a Missouri railroad town, sign a single sheet of paper, and walk away with a child that no one would ever ask about again, no follow-up, no inspection, no record beyond that one signature. The Marlows met those trains. The ledgers that survived show Marlow men travelling to the railhead again and again across 4 decades, and every trip lines up with a documented orphan train arrival. They were not adopting children. They were acquiring a workforce that came with a guarantee built in. Nobody was coming to look for them. What happened to those children in the hollow is the part of this story where the copper and the cut stone stop mattering and you are left with something that just sits in your chest. The Marlows kept them below. In the buried settlement, in the tunnels the family had cleared, generations of children who did not officially exist worked the salvage, hauling metal up the great stone staircase that Elias Coop would eventually descend. They were small enough to fit into the collapsed sections. They were expendable in a way grown men were not. And when the county finally came up that road in 1974, the surveyor did not just find a wall and a door, he found the smaller things. He found the reason the old-timers wouldn't drive past the turnoff after dark. He found what a family will do to keep a secret worth 30 years of copper, and he found the arithmetic of how many small workers it takes to empty a city and how few of them ever came back up. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how the Marlows got away with it for so long, you have to understand the thing that made their salvage so valuable in the first place. It was not just the copper as raw metal. It was what the copper had been part of. The buried settlement under Widow's Hollow was wired, threaded through the cut stone walls, wrapped around iron cores, laid in patterns that no salvage crew of illiterate farmers could have designed, was a system. The Marlow descendants who talked, and a few of them eventually did, described their ancestors pulling coils of copper out of the walls that were still warm to the touch. Warm. In a structure that had been buried and dead for longer than anyone could say. Whatever that city had been, it had been built to move energy through itself, and some fraction of that capacity was still, faintly, working when Absalom Marlow first cut his way in. This is the piece of the reset story that gets people called crazy. So let me lay it out plainly, and you can do with it what you want. The claim is that the buried world ran on a form of energy that the world above never recovered, and in most cases was never allowed to recover. Energy drawn from the atmosphere, from the ground itself, from the arrangement of the structures rather than from fuel burned inside them. Look at the architecture we inherited and cannot explain. The star forts, those perfect geometric fortifications that ring the globe on every continent, built to a standard of precision that supposedly primitive engineers achieved over and over in places that never spoke to each other. The domes, the spires, the vast exposition halls of the world's fairs, buildings the size of small towns, filled with lights and machinery, thrown up in months and then, we are told, demolished on purpose, torn down as if they were nothing. What if those buildings were not celebrations of a new industrial age? What if they were the last working pieces of the old one, put on display one final time before the men who inherited them decided that a world without free energy was easier to control than a world with it? The Marlows understood a version of this, even if they could not have explained it in those words. They knew that the copper they pulled out of the hollow was not ordinary scrap. Absalom did not sell all of it. The bank ledger shows the deposits, yes, but it also shows something the family kept for themselves, held back, hoarded in a vault they cut into the rock below the house. And the descendants who talked all agree on one detail. The Marlows never once tried to make the old system work again. They could have. They had it, intact, warm, humming in the walls of the buried city. And instead of studying it, instead of trying to light their homes with it or share it with the world, they methodically tore it apart and sold it for its weight. That was the deal. That was always the deal. The families who were allowed to profit from the buried world were the ones who agreed to destroy it as they emptied it. You did not get to keep the machine. You only got to sell the parts. Who made that deal? Who draws a blank patch on a state map and keeps it blank for 90 years? This is where the Marlow story reaches up out of the hollow and touches the shape of the whole country. Because the paperwork that protected Widow's Hollow was not local. County clerks do not have the power to erase 800 acres from a state survey. That kind of erasure requires cooperation at a level far above a rural Missouri courthouse, and the deed records, what survives of them, show exactly that kind of hand at work. Filings that reference federal survey exemptions that do not appear in any published statute. Correspondence, quoted in a single deposition from the 1930s, between a Marlow lawyer and an office in Washington that the deposition names only as the Bureau. Not the Census Bureau, not the Land Bureau, just the Bureau, capital B, the way you refer to something everyone in the room already understands and no one wants to say aloud. Let's slow down here, because this is the turn where the story stops being about a rotten mountain family and becomes something you cannot unsee. If the Marlows had a deal with a federal office to strip a buried settlement in exchange for silence, then Widow's Hollow was not an anomaly, it was a node. One site, in a continental operation, salvaging a buried world piece by piece, and feeding the materials into the economy of the world above, while insisting, on every map and in every schoolbook, that the buried world had never existed. The copper the Marlows sold did not vanish. It went into the bank, and out of the bank into the wider economy, into the wiring of a nation that was electrifying itself at exactly the moment these salvage families were at their peak. Think about the timing. The great electrification of America, the moment the lights came on from coast to coast, happens in the same decades that families like the Marlows were pulling warm copper coils out of the ground by the ton. We are told the copper was mined. Some of it was, but how much of it was inherited, stripped out of a system that already knew how to carry current, and quietly folded into the story of human progress so that no one would ask where the sudden abundance came from? The Marlows grew powerful on this arrangement, and power made them careless. By the 1880s, Absalom was old, and his sons had none of his discipline. The founder had understood that the whole operation depended on invisibility, on being the boring poor family in the valley nobody bothered about. His sons wanted to be seen. They started buying property in the county seat, real property, grand houses that a homesteading family had no business affording. They started marrying into the families of local officials, which meant the secret was no longer contained to the hollow. They started, and this is the beginning of the end, to compete with the very office that had protected them, because the sons had realized what their father never dared to. If the copper was valuable, the intact machinery was priceless, and they wanted to sell it whole, to the highest bidder. Deal with the Bureau, be damned. There is a gap in the record here, a silence that lasts most of a decade, and when the record picks up again, the Marlow family has been cut roughly in half, not by disease, not by any recorded violence. They simply stop appearing. Names that fill the ledgers in 1888 are gone by 1896. No death recorded, no burial, no probate. The grand houses in the county seat are sold, quietly, at a loss. The mouth of the great staircase is sealed, not collapsed by accident, but deliberately walled, the same tight-fitted stonework as the buried city itself, as if whoever closed it had access to the old techniques. And the family that remains in the hollow goes silent and small and frightened, the way you get when you have watched what happens to people who break the deal. Whatever the sons tried to sell, and whoever they tried to sell it to, the answer came back in a form that taught the survivors to spend the next 80 years paying no taxes, registering no births, and burying no bodies, because to appear on any record at all was to be found. For most of the 20th century, Widow's Hollow simply sat. The Marlows who were left lived off the founder's hidden vault, careful, invisible, dwindling. The world forgot them, which was exactly what the deal required. The valley stayed blank on the maps. The old-timers kept their silence. And the buried city under the hills, half emptied, its warm copper mostly stripped, waited in the dark behind a sealed door. It might have stayed that way forever if not for a washed-out logging road and a county surveyor who took a wrong turn into a patch of map that should not have been blank. When Elias Coop came down out of the hollow in 1974 and started making calls, the machine that had protected the Marlows for a century woke up one last time. Coop's survey was never filed. The county has no record it was ever commissioned, though 3 separate people remembered him being sent. His field notes, the ones he did not carry out in his own pocket, vanished from the county office within the month. And when a young reporter tried to follow the story in 1981, the only source willing to talk was Coop himself, 4 shaking sentences over cold coffee before he asked the reporter to leave and never contacted him again. The reporter kept digging anyway. He is the reason we know as much as we do, and he paid the price that people who dig too deep into the reset tend to pay. His paper folded. His notes were, in his own account, stolen twice. and the one photograph he claimed to have obtained, a shot taken by Coop at the bottom of the staircase, showing the fitted stone wall and the door, and something the reporter would only describe as writing that was not in any alphabet he recognized, was never published, because by the time he was ready to run it, he no longer had it. So what do we actually have? What survives the scrubbing, more than the Bureau would like? We have the land claim of 1,849, paid in gold, filed by a man with tools finer than the government's. We have 3 decades of bank deposits in refined copper, stamped with a maker's mark no historian can place. We have the orphan train ledgers, and the trips to the railhead that line up with them, trip for trip. We have a deposition from the 1930s that quotes a letter to something called the Bureau. We have a valley that stayed blank on the state map into the 1970s. We have a surveyor who quit and fled and shook for the rest of his life. And we have the descendants, the handful of Marlows who eventually left the hollow and, decades later, told the same story to different people who never met each other. Warm copper in the walls. A city under the clay. Children who went down the stairs and did not come up. A deal that let the family sell the parts as long as they destroyed the machine. It is a lot of smoke for there to be no fire. Now, the skeptic in you is entitled to speak, and I want to give it room, because a story is only worth telling if it can survive an honest look. The mainstream explanation for every piece of this is available, and it is not stupid. The buried windows and the below-grade floors in old cities are real, and the accepted reason is that streets were raised over time for drainage and utilities, which genuinely happened in many places. The grand architecture of poor frontier towns reflects civic ambition and cheap, skilled immigrant labour, not lost technology. The star forts are a well-understood response to the invention of the cannon, their geometry a matter of deflecting artillery. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Not channeling energy. The World's Fair buildings were built to be temporary because they were made of plaster and lath, never meant to last, and demolishing them was cheaper than maintaining them. The orphan trains were mostly what they claimed to be, and copper was mined in enormous and well-documented quantities, which is why the lights came on. Every single thread in the Marlow story has an ordinary explanation, and an honest person has to hold that in one hand while holding the strangeness in the other. But here is what the ordinary explanations do not touch, and it is the thing that keeps this story alive. They explain each thread on its own. They do not explain the knot. They do not explain why a specific family, in a specific blank valley, got specifically rich on salvaged copper with an unidentifiable maker's mark, while meeting orphan trains for 40 years, protected by paperwork that references a federal office, no statute names, in a valley erased from the state map for a century, guarded well enough that a government surveyor abandoned his career rather than file what he saw. Any one of those facts is a coincidence. All of them together, braided into the same 800 acres, is a pattern. And the reset is, at bottom, just a name for taking the pattern seriously when the official story insists on explaining each strand separately and hoping you never lay them side by side. Start with the copper, because the copper is the one thing that cannot argue back. Every ingot the Marlows deposited carried the same stamp, a mark the bank clerks described in their records as a sunburst wrapped around a single vertical bar. In the 1960s, a metallurgist at a state university got hold of 2 of those ingots, sold off decades earlier when the bank liquidated part of its holdings, and he did what a careful scientist does. He tried to trace them. He wrote to every copper foundry and mint whose marks were catalogued, in America and in Europe, and he came back with nothing. The mark matched no registered maker. The refinement of the metal was the stranger part. His analysis, which survives in a single dry paragraph in a journal nobody reads, noted that the copper was purer than the standard commercial refining of the 1860s could reliably produce, and that it carried trace elements in a ratio he described, in the flattest possible language, as inconsistent with known ore bodies of the region or of any region he could identify. He did not say it came from a buried city. He was a serious man, and he wanted to keep his job. He just laid the numbers down and let them sit there. And the numbers say that the Marlows were selling refined metal that should not have existed, made by a process nobody could name, from a source that appears on no map. Now the labour, and here I want to give you a name, because the ledgers gave up exactly one. Most of the children who went up that road are gone past recovery, arrival lines with no surname, handed off with a signature and swallowed by the hollow. But one of them got out, and he got out because he ran, and because he was old enough when he ran to remember. His name, as best the reporter could reconstruct it, was Thomas Kell. He came off an orphan train around 1889, one of the last the Marlows met before everything came apart, and he was signed for by a Marlow son at a station platform in front of a matron who wrote a single line and moved on to the next child. Thomas Kell spent, by his own account given decades later to a county relief worker, something close to 4 years below. He described the staircase. He described the walls that were fitted too tight for a blade. He described being small enough to be sent into the collapsed galleries where the grown men would not fit, to pull the warm coils out of the crush by hand, and he described the ones who went in and did not come back, and how the family did not so much as pause the work to dig for them. He described the maker's mark, the sunburst and the bar, and said it was cut into the stone of the buried place in 100 spots, the same mark that ended up on the ingots, as if the family had simply copied for their stamp the sign they found already carved through the city they were stripping. The relief worker who took Thomas Kell's statement did not believe a word of it and said so in the margin. "An old man's fantasy," she wrote, "most likely drink." But she took the statement down in full anyway, because that was her job, and that is the only reason we have it, and here is the detail that turns a drunk old man's fantasy into something colder. Thomas Kell described the layout of the buried settlement, the arrangement of the galleries and the central hall, and the way the great staircase came down into it, in 1931. Elias Coupe, who could not have read a relief file that sat forgotten in a county basement, described the same staircase, the same fitted walls, the same door, in 1974. 2 men, 43 years apart, neither one connected to the other, and they draw you the same buried city. You can call the first one a fantasy. You can call the second one a fright. You cannot easily call them the same fantasy and the same fright, arrived at independently, about a place the state insisted was raw wilderness. The descendants are the third leg of the table, and they are the ones the family could not fully silence, because you cannot murder your own bloodline out of existence without eventually running out of bloodline. When the Marlow line finally scattered in the middle of the 20th century, the ones who left carried the story out with them, and over the following decades a handful of them told it, to journalists and researchers, and in 2 cases to their own children who later wrote it down. They never coordinated. Several of them died before the others ever spoke. And yet the accounts rhyme in a way invented stories do not. Every one of them mentions the warmth of the copper. Every one mentions the sealed staircase and the family's terror of it after the 1890s. Every one describes a hidden vault below the founder's house, where the truly strange salvage was kept, the pieces Absalom would not sell, and every one uses some version of the same phrase to describe what the family understood their arrangement to be. We were allowed to take it apart. We were never allowed to make it work. That sentence, in slightly different words, comes up again and again from people who never met, and it is the sentence that should keep you up at night, because it is not a description of poverty or greed. It is a description of a rule. Somebody set that rule. Somebody enforced it. Which brings us back to the question of who, and to the uncomfortable fact that Widow's Hollow was never the only hollow. Once you know the pattern, you start seeing it, and the seeing does not stop. A family arrives in a remote place with money they should not have and tools they should not own. They claim ground the record calls empty. They grow rich on salvaged material with no honest local source, dealing in metal or cut stone or strange refined goods that the surrounding economy cannot account for. They protect themselves with paperwork that reaches higher than any local office should be able to reach. And the map goes quiet around them. There is a family in the Appalachians with almost the identical profile, salvaging what the records vaguely call fixtures from ground that was supposedly untouched forest. There is one in the desert southwest, dealing in dressed stone of a quality no frontier quarry produced, from a claim that no survey would fully map for 80 years. The reporter who chased the Marlows started, near the end, to chase the others, and that is the point at which the story stopped being about one rotten family and became the thing that broke him, because he understood that he was no longer looking at a crime. He was looking at an industry, a continental salvage of a buried world, parcelled out to families willing to keep the secret, feeding its harvest quietly into the economy of the age that was replacing it. And the age that was replacing it needed the harvest, which is the economic heart of this whole story and the part the school books are structurally incapable of telling you. Think honestly about the second half of the 1800s. In the span of a single human lifetime, a country of mud roads and candlelight becomes a country of rail and steel and electric light strung from coast to coast. We are taught to marvel at this and to attribute it entirely to invention, to the lone genius in the workshop, to the forward march of progress. But invention does not conjure raw material out of nothing. Electrifying a continent takes staggering, almost unimaginable quantities of copper, and it takes them fast, in the exact decades when families like the Marlows were pulling warm copper coils out of the ground by the wagon load. We are told all of that copper was mined, and a great deal of it demonstrably was. But the demand curve and the salvage curve rise together so neatly, and the story of sudden material abundance sits so awkwardly against the older story of scarcity, that a reasonable person is allowed to wonder how much of the modern world was not built from the ground up at all, but inherited, stripped out of a system that had already solved the problem of carrying current, and folded seamlessly into the myth of our own cleverness. The star forts are worth sitting with here, because they are the piece of the puzzle you can still go and stand inside. All across the world, on every inhabited continent, there are these fortifications built to the same precise geometric plan, points radiating from a centre like a frozen explosion, executed to a standard of engineering that supposedly isolated and primitive builders achieved over and over in places that never traded a single idea. The official answer is that the shape defeats cannon fire, the angled points denying an attacker any flat wall to batter and any dead ground to hide in, and as far as it goes, that answer is sound. But it explains the shape without explaining the coincidence, the way this one design appears, fully formed and nearly identical, in the Americas and Europe and Asia and Africa, as if it were not invented independently 100 times but remembered or copied from a common source that the reset erased. The people who take the buried world seriously look at those perfect geometries and see the footprint of the old order, the same order that carved a sunburst and a bar into the walls of a settlement under the Ozarks, and they ask why a shape so widespread and so precise should have left no inventor's name, no evolution of failed early attempts, nothing but the finished perfect thing, standing everywhere at once. And the world's fairs, those enormous white expositions that rose in city after city at the turn of the century, are the same question asked in a different key. We are shown the photographs of vast palatial halls, acres under a single roof, blazing with more electric light than the surrounding city could plausibly generate, filled with machinery whose purpose the captions rarely explain. We are told these wonders were thrown up in a matter of months, out of plaster and lath, as temporary celebrations of progress, and then torn down deliberately when the fair closed, demolished as if they were nothing, at a cost that makes no sense for something so grand. Set the Marlow story next to those buildings and a darker reading offers itself. What if some of those halls were not built at all in the way we are told, but uncovered or reconstructed on old foundations from old plans, the last intact pieces of the buried world put on public display one final time, lit up with the very system the salvage families were busy stripping out of the ground, and then destroyed on purpose the moment the crowds went home, so that the memory of what a working piece of the old world looked like could not take root. Demolition, in that reading, is not waste. It is policy, the same policy that sealed a staircase in the Ozarks and reshaped a whole hillside so no one could ever walk down it again. I want to be careful and fair, because this is the ledge where a lot of storytellers go over, and I would rather stop short of it with you than lose you. There is no single artifact in the Marlow story that a determined skeptic cannot explain away in isolation, and I have already given that skeptic his say. The copper anomaly could be a bad assay. The matching descriptions of the staircase could be a chain of rumour rather than two independent witnesses. The pattern of salvage families could be the human tendency to see faces in clouds, to find a conspiracy in what is only the ordinary churn of frontier fortunes and lost paperwork. Every rope in this net has a frayed end you can pull. But there is a difference between a story that survives one hard question and a story that survives all of them at once, and the Marlow story keeps failing to fall apart. Pull the copper thread, and the orphan ledgers are still there. Pull the ledgers, and the sealed staircase is still there, reshaped at great expense by someone with reason and money and access. Pull the staircase, and the blank valley on the state map is still there, into the 1970s, in a country that had mapped every other acre of itself twice over. The strength of the thing is not in any one thread. It is in how they refuse, altogether, to come untied. There is one more stretch of this I owe you before the end, and it is the decade the record goes dark, the 1890s, when half the family simply stops existing. I told you the sons got greedy and tried to sell the machine whole, and that whatever answer came back taught the survivors to spend 80 years hiding. Here is what little we can reconstruct of that answer. In 1891, a Marlow son travelled east, further east than the family ever went, and the one letter that survives from that trip, quoted in the same 1930s deposition that names the Bureau, has him writing home that he had found a buyer of extraordinary means, and that the family's days of pulling scrap by hand were finished. He was, he wrote, going to sell them the whole hollow, city and system and all, and they would never have to touch the stairs again. That is the last anyone hears from him. He does not come home. Within 2 years the grand houses in the county seat are sold at a loss. The staircase is walled with the old fitted stonework that only the buried world's own techniques could produce, and the family that remains has been cut in half with no deaths on any register. You are free to imagine what happened to a man who tried to sell, to a private buyer, a thing that a federal office had spent 40 years keeping off the map. The survivors clearly imagined it too, every day, for the rest of their lives, which is why they never again registered a birth or a death, or paid a cent of tax, because they had learned the one lesson the arrangement was designed to teach. To appear on any record at all was to be found, and to be found, if you had broken the deal, was to stop appearing anywhere ever again. Let's return to the children, because they are the moral weight this story has to carry, and because they are where the economic history and the human history become the same thing. Strip away every claim you find too wild. Forget the warm copper. Forget the free energy. Forget the Bureau. What is left, on the surviving paper alone, is a family that acquired children through a system with no oversight, put them to labour no one ever inspected, in a place no one was permitted to map, and produced from that labour a fortune in metal with no honest local source. That is not a theory. That is a business model, and versions of it built more of the wealth we inherited than the school books will ever admit. The genius of a system like the orphan trains, from the point of view of a man like Absalom Marlow, was that it laundered human beings into labour and then out of memory. A child who arrives with no name the state will honour, works in a place the state pretends does not exist, and dies without a record, has been erased 3 times over. The buried city hid the source of the wealth. The orphan trains hid the source of the labour, and the blank map hid both. This is the part of the reset that I think matters more than the star forts and the free energy, and it is the part that gets the least attention, because it is the least fun to think about. If there really was a controlled salvage of a buried world, then its true cost was never counted in copper. It was counted in the people fed into the operation to keep it quiet. Every secret that size runs on disposable human beings, and the 19th century was extraordinarily good at manufacturing disposable human beings and shipping them wherever the quiet work needed doing. You do not need to believe in an ancient advanced civilization to find that horrifying. You only need to believe the ledgers, and the ledgers are the least disputed thing we have. There is a geological detail here that the reset people cling to and the geologists wave away, and you should hear both hands of it. The buried world under Widow's Hollow, in every account we have, sits beneath a layer of packed sediment, a dense skin of clay and silt that had to be cut through before the cut stone walls began. The official reading of a layer like that is simple and boring. It is erosion, the slow work of water and time. hillside washing down over a settlement that was abandoned and forgotten in the ordinary way, nothing stranger than mud being mud. But the reset reading points at the sameness of it, the way that dense sediment skin turns up not just in one hollow but wherever the buried world is said to lie, at roughly the same depth, packed the same way, as if it were laid down not by 1,000 slow years of rain but by one fast event, a single continental drowning of mud that buried the old order in a season and left the sediment signature that families like the Marlows would later learn to recognize as the mark of buried treasure. A mud flood, they call it, and the geologists roll their eyes. And the geologists are probably right, and yet the story needs you to notice that the men who got rich did not dig at random. They knew the sediment skin meant a city underneath. Absalom Marlow arrived in 1849 knowing exactly where to cut, which is not the behavior of a man exploring wilderness. It is the behavior of a man reading a map that the rest of us were never shown. And then there is the vault, the one piece of the Marlow story that might, in theory, still exist, sealed in the rock below a founder's house in a valley that has been reshaped to look like nothing. Every descendant who talked mentions it, and their accounts of what Absalom hoarded there are the strangest testimony we have, precisely because they do not describe treasure in any ordinary sense. They describe pieces, components pulled from the buried system that the old man would not melt down and would not sell, kept back, wrapped and shelved, as though he suspected that a day might come when a whole and working fragment of the old world would be worth more than all the copper he ever banked. A device, more than one of them, called it, without ever being able to say what it did, only that their parents spoke of it in the lowered voice families reserve for the things that frighten them. Absalom Marlow spent 30 years destroying the machine on the orders of whoever drew the blank map, and in a locked room under his own house he quietly disobeyed and saved a handful of its parts, and never dared to assemble them, and passed the fear of them down to children who passed it down again until there was almost no one left to be afraid. If that vault is still down there, it is the one testable claim in this whole story, waiting under a graded hillside for someone with a permit and a very good reason. Nobody has ever gone to look, or if they have joined the long list of people connected to Widow's Hollow who simply stopped appearing. By the time the reporter gave up in the mid-1980s, the Marlow line in the hollow had nearly ended. The last of them, an old woman the neighbours called Sister Ada, lived alone in the founder's house above the sealed staircase until sometime in the early 90s, when she too simply stopped appearing, no death recorded in the family tradition. When the state finally did survey the valley, quietly, for a utility easement, the great staircase was gone, not sealed, gone. Filled, graded, planted over, the whole slope reshaped so completely that the survey crew reported nothing but ordinary hillside. Somebody, at the very end, spent real money and real effort to make sure that what Elias Coupe walked down in 1974 could never be walked down again. That is not the behavior of a poor mountain family. That is the behavior of an operation closing a site. So what was under Widow's Hollow? We have the surveyor's 4 shaking sentences, the reporter's lost photograph, and the descendants' matching stories, and beyond that we have the shape of the hole in the record, which is sometimes the most honest thing you can read. History is not only what is written down, it is also the specific silences, the valleys left blank, the offices referred to only as the bureau, the children who appear on an arrival ledger and never on any other page again. When the silences form a pattern that neat, across that many decades, in that specific a place, you are no longer looking at the absence of a story. You are looking at a story that somebody worked very hard to keep absent. The Marlows are called the Ozarks' most rotten mountain family, and by every ordinary measure the name fits. They were secretive and grasping and, on the evidence of what they did to those children, monstrous. But I want to leave you with the thought that has followed me through every page of this. The Marlows did not create the world they profited from. They found it buried, warm and waiting, and they made the same choice that men in far grander offices were making across the whole continent in those same decades. They chose to sell the parts rather than share the machine. They chose a smaller, controllable world over a larger, freer one. The Marlows just did it in a hollow, with their own hands, close enough to the crime that they could not lie to themselves about the cost. The men who drew the blank patch on the map did the same thing from a desk, with cleaner hands and better paperwork, and we call them founders and progress and the modern age. And maybe that is the real reason a valley can stay blank on a map for 100 years, and it has nothing to do with any office called the Bureau. Maybe the erasure is something we do to ourselves. A working piece of the old world would mean that the story we were raised on, the story of our own steady climb from candlelight to the grid by nothing but our own genius, was never quite true. It would mean that a great deal of what we call invention was inheritance, that a great deal of what we call progress was salvage, and that some of the ground we were told was empty was full the whole time, full of a solved problem we were not allowed to keep. That is a hard thing to carry, harder than any ghost story, and it may be that the map goes blank not because a man in Washington ordered it, but because a whole civilization would rather not look. The Marlows only did in miniature, with their own hands and their own dead, what the age around them was doing at continental scale and calling the modern world. They sealed the staircase, we sealed the memory, and a sealed thing, given enough years, becomes indistinguishable from a thing that was never there, which is exactly what the arrangement always counted on. The copper the Marlows tore out of the ground is still with us. It is in the walls, it is in the grid. It was folded so thoroughly into the story of how the lights came on that you would never guess a single strand of it came up a stone staircase in a valley that was not allowed to exist, carried by a child whose name no one bothered to write down. That is the real inheritance of Widow's Hollow, and of every hollow like it, not a lost technology, not a secret we could dig back up if we were brave enough. Just the ordinary, buried, load-bearing truth that a great deal of what we were handed as progress was salvage, that a great deal of what we were told was empty was full, and that the difference between a founder and a scavenger is mostly a matter of whether history remembered to erase the staircase behind you. Elias Coupe died in 1994. The reporter, the last time anyone spoke to him, was living in a different name, in a different state, and would not discuss the Marlows at all, except to say one thing, which is where we will end. He said the worst part was never the door, or the wall, or the writing that was not in any alphabet. The worst part was the stairs themselves, because they were worn smooth in the centre, the way stone only wears when feet go up and down it, year after year, 10,000 times over, carrying something heavy, in the dark, for a very long time. Somebody built those stairs to be used, and somebody used them right up until the day it was decided that the valley had always been empty, and the map went blank, and the world above agreed, the way it so often has, to remember only the version that let everyone sleep. And the stairs are gone now, ground into the hillside with everything else, so there is no one left to climb them and nothing left to carry, which is the cleanest end an operation like this could ask for. No wall, no door, no worn stone in the dark. Only a quiet slope in a valley with a name, where the water runs the way water runs, and the map at long last tells the simple truth it was always built to tell, that here there is nothing, that here there was never anything, and that the ground beneath your feet has always been empty.